All right, folks, we are back here on Issues and Answers Friday, straight out of the cannon with me, Scott Cannon, here on WLTH 1370 AM. It is 6:38 in the PM on October the 25th, 2025. Folks, the future is here. The future is now. Before we left, we talked about the government influence over our movies and TV shows and how much of what we see is propaganda. Because it is affected by different entities like the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the FBI. But it's not just movies. It's not just TV that is affected by these entities that have an interest in maintaining the hegemony of the American government around the world. No, they are and have always used music as one of the great selling points of the American empire. Now, I hear it all the time. I know you guys do too. Every 5 minutes, oh man, the government props up gangster rap or this type of rap or whatever because it gives negative images to the black community. The government props up this types of music. The government props up this type of music. And what a lot of people don't understand is that the government has had its hand in popular music since there's been popular music. The government doesn't just prop up the stuff you don't like. The government has propped up the stuff that you do like as well. So a lot of our culture has been used as propaganda. Black music, particularly, has always been used as propaganda. Now, I want to give a special shout out to Miss Esha K, because she was really the inspiration for this whole segment and this whole show, because I just really watched her on Bad Faith with Brianna Joy Gray, who I think is the best interviewer on the planet currently. She has the patience of a saint and can interview some of the most narcissistic and toxic individuals without completely losing her cool. And I love watching it. She does a very great job of cutting through a lot of the propaganda in our culture. And she had a guest on named Miss Esha K, who has a website called Historically. And they started talking about how America has always used pop culture, particularly music, as a way to control audiences, control the public, and also control America's image around the world. And to propagate the capitalist system around the world. And so I checked out Miss Esha K's website, and I read this article, and it was really eye-opening about how the United States had used jazz. Yes, going all the way back to jazz. Jazz was used as a psyop as well, folks. Going all the way back to the 40s and 50s, using jazz as a psyop. I really want to, like I said, I want to thank her for writing this, because this was a bombshell to me, and I'm used to reading how our government behaves itself in this country and around the world, but this was really eye-opening. After World War II, U.S. hegemony faced a unique challenge. African and Asian countries began liberating themselves from their colonial masters whose armies could no longer sustain the oppressive violence that they needed to maintain their colonies. Capitalism had been thoroughly discredited, not only in the Eastern Bloc, where anti-fascist governments took power, but in Western Europe as well. Intellectuals, artists, and musicians in Western Europe increasingly embraced Marxism as the prevailing ideology. While the U.S. industrial power had an awe-inspiring reputation for producing unprecedented consumer goods, culturally, the United States was viewed as a backwater that created no innovative works of art, music, or literature. Classical music was seen as a European creation. Hollywood had still not perfected its blockbusters, and the American authors who were well known abroad, like Ernest Hemingway and John Steinbeck, all had socialist leanings, which would not be of any help for the U.S. government officials who were trying to sell American capitalism abroad. So this is where they found themselves. They found themselves after World War II going, look, the Soviet Union is getting more powerful because, you know, one of the great lies that the corporate media owned by a few billionaires tells you is that, well, socialism, communism just collapsed and didn't work. Dude, at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was a backwater country. Most of the population was illiterate and lived in abject poverty. Okay? And between the 1930s and the 1960s, it went from being an abject poor backwater where most people were illiterate to the second most powerful empire on the planet. Now, I'm not saying you got to go out and be a communist. I'm not a communist. But to completely poo-poo what the communist system was able to accomplish for the Soviet Union, and then later for China, which now China's pretty much universally considered the second most powerful country in the world after the United States. And I know a lot of people say, well, China embraced capitalism. No, the majority of China's GDP is still in its public sector. It's just sort of state-controlled. You know, it's not capitalism. It's still state control, a one-party state. And so the United States felt Russia on its heels. And so they went into overdrive producing propaganda. In an effort to win influence all over the world, the United States has two problems, big problems. Their actions around the world make it clear that the U.S. wants to replace former colonial powers. And second, the racial discrimination in the United States made it difficult to win influence in countries populated mainly by people of color. So it's pretty obvious that if you are somebody in Africa or in the Middle East or in Latin America and you see how America's treating black people throughout the 1940s and 50s, you might not be so keen to want to think that America is this sort of shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan would put it. Their efforts to win influence amongst people of color was severely hampered by the overt racial discrimination that black people faced in the United States. They could not convince African heads of state that they envisioned a partnership on equal footing when most black people were oppressed at home through their overt racial segregation and more insidious economic discrimination. And so that's an important thing to state. There are a lot of groups that have sprung up in recent years, like ADOS and FBA and other groups who, and I agree with them on some things. I definitely agree with them when it comes to celebrating the legacy of legacy black Americans here in this country. I am proud to be a legacy black American. I love to talk about my family's roots in Mississippi and Arkansas and those types of places. But there's also been this sort of perpetual, I believe, a falsehood that comes from some of the people who believe those groups or who are supporting of those groups, that Africans have never at any point over the last 400 years seen themselves in solidarity with black Americans in any way, that they just sort of sold us all and just said, screw you, as you know, you guys are black Americans. That's not exactly true. You listen to the words of Patrice Lumumba, you listen to the words of Nelson Mandela, you listen to the words of so many leaders from the continent, especially when they were getting free, Robert Mugabe and all these other people. It's pretty obvious. And the feeling was mutual. You look at Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and all these other people, there was definitely some reciprocal respect and admiration going on there. In Western Europe, the traditional leftist artists in their expressions used art for politics, which often highlighted the crimes of colonialism. For example, Pablo Picasso, who was a Marxist, used his art for political messages. One example is his painting Massacre in Korea, which highlighted the atrocities committed by the United States in the Korean War. And that's important to talk about as well. America literally killed 20% of North Korea's population in the 1950s. 20%. For some context, what is 20% of America's population? There's 340 million Americans. So that would be like killing about 68 million Americans. Imagine if some foreign power came here and killed 68 million Americans. That would be atrocious, right? That'd never be forgiven, right? Okay. I mean, 9/11, white people have never gotten over 9/11. I hate to call y'all out, but it's just real. Y'all never got over 9/11. 9/11 killed 2,000 people. America killed the equivalent of 68 million in Korea. The equivalent, But we don't talk about that very often. We don't talk about the Korean War and how the brutality of America's bombing. Well, we dropped more bombs on Korea than we did in World War II. Just on that one country. A conversation on the grounds of colonial crimes was one that the U.S. could not win. Therefore, the U.S. strategy was to change the conversation. This problem was tackled by two agencies: the United States Information Agency, which was created in 1953 and operated under the State Department within U.S. embassies, and the CIA, as we discussed earlier, also took to sponsoring many umbrella organizations aimed at this effort. They focused on art forms that removed political messages from leftist art. One of the art forms that they chose to sponsor was modern art, whose abstract expression steered the conversation about the boundaries and definitions of what is actually art and steered the conversation away from political commentary. In fact, the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, I know you guys have seen MoMA talked about in the news, was filled with national security ties. So the government literally infiltrated modern art academies at different entities like MoMA. Under the security patronage of the CIA, MoMA arranged many art exhibits all throughout the world. In fact, the State Department in 1946 spent thousands to purchase modern art pieces featuring artists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Jackson Pollock. Now, Georgia O'Keeffe is famous for all those paintings that are supposedly flowers, but instead, most people tend to interpret them as being sort of euphemisms or sort of, I guess I'd say maybe a euphemism for a woman's private areas. And I mean, that's what she's famous for. That's like her that was her trademark. She would make paintings that people would say, oh my God, that looks like a woman's private area. Okay. And Jackson Pollock is famous for all those paintings that look like a 5-year-old just threw crap at the wall. And so that's where they steered modern art too. The CIA did that. So it's not even just overt propaganda like Black Panther or Top Gun, which was just a pure, at least they were open about it being a propaganda film. But it's also Jackson Pollock and Georgia O'Keeffe paintings. In the field of literature, the United States government sponsored many magazines around the world, such as the London-based Encounter and the French language Prouves. They featured writers who strayed away from critiquing concrete actions of the United States to celebrating more abstract notions like freedom and democracy. This helped create what later CIA employee Cord Meyer described as a compatible left. And so this is the problem that we on the left have in this country now, is that the historic left, the left of the New Deal, the organized labor left, that was full of communists, full of socialists, these were the people who were fighting for civil rights before Martin Luther King, before the supposed civil rights movement. They, were drummed out in favor of a compatible left, which is full of people like we see now pushing abortion, pushing the LGBTQRSTUV agenda, transgender bathrooms. When we're talking about that stuff, we're not talking about capitalism. We're not talking about the military-industrial complex. We're not talking about the prison-industrial complex. We're not talking about how rich people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates are. Elon Musk, I just did the story last week, is trying to rig Twitter so that negative stories about Donald Trump will be taken down. Bill Gates just donated $50 million to Kamala Harris's campaign and has spent the last 4 years basically dictating vaccine policy in America when Bill Gates isn't even a doctor. And so this is what the billionaire oligarchs who control our society are doing. Absent an actual left wing to fight back against them. The field of music was used to combat the most heavy criticisms levied against the United States, namely the brutal racial oppression faced by Black Americans. The U.S. had an uphill battle of convincing many freed African nations that it was interested in being an equal partner when Black Americans faced overt segregation and more insidious forms of economic discrimination in the United States. Now, what was the United States' answer for this? I'll wait. It was to promote jazz music. That's right. Jazz. Now, why'd they do this? Well, in one embarrassing incident, 2 Ghanaian diplomats faced discrimination in a Denny's in Delaware which prompted the Eisenhower administration to desegregate a stretch of highway between New York and Washington, which diplomats frequently traveled between. So this is another lie that I get from some, of the new black nationalist groups like ADOS and FBA. Well, Africans never had to deal with any of the Jim Crow policies. They weren't considered black under Jim Crow. That's not true. That's not true at all. African diplomats who would come to this country and try to eat in the South were told to get into the nigger section. Okay? I'm just being real with you guys, folks. Okay? Roberto Clemente, the great baseball player, the great Puerto Rican baseball player, was a black Puerto Rican. He was not allowed to eat with his white teammates. He had to go eat in the nigger section. And he had to go stay in the nigger hotel. Reggie Jackson, too. A lot of y'all didn't know Reggie Jackson's Puerto Rican. He had to eat with the niggers. Okay? And I didn't say nigga, I said niggers, because that's what they were called in that day. Okay? So whether they didn't care whether you was Puerto Rican like my man Roberto Clemente or Reggie Jackson, or whether you were from Ghana and you were a whole diplomat of a country, a distinguished diplomat from a sovereign nation, if you were black, you weren't going to eat at this Denny's unless you were eating in the nigger section. So that's just the way it was in that time period. Unlike classical music, jazz music could be touted as uniquely American in its form of expression. It started in New Orleans mainly from black Americans who would use a mix of rhythms and fast-paced improvisations. With predominant artists being mostly black Americans, they could showcase them on a world stage, which would alleviate the charges that the United States was engaging in active racial discrimination. So this is why they always make sure that you see black people in music. This is why they make sure you always see black people in sports. This is why they make sure you always see black people in movies and on TV. We're 13% of the population, folks. But we're probably about 50% of America's famous people. Which is why people always, when we start talking about reparations and we start talking about the sort of economic and racial injustices that have happened in this country to the black community specifically, they go, well, what about Oprah? Michael Jordan's a billionaire. You know, they've been doing this for many decades now, right here. Under these guises, the State Department arranged for jazz diplomacy tours around the world. They sponsored artists like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong to tour around Africa. Of course, being sponsored by the State Department did soften some of the harsh critics, both of these criticisms that these artists had about racism in America. For example, in 1954, after the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregation was inherently unequal, the instructed states to proceed to desegregate with all deliberate speed. Now, of course, most states did the exact opposite and tried to hinder any efforts at integration at any step. In 1957, when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus deployed the Arkansas National Guard to the surrounding Central High School to prevent the 9 black students from enrolling in the school, Louis Armstrong had a very harsh critique. He said, "The way they're treating my people in the South, this government can go to hell." Okay, so that's Louis Armstrong in 1957 after Brown versus Board of Education. However, after accepting his position as a jazz ambassador in 1960, when he was asked about racism in America, His reply was, "I don't know anything about that. I'm just a trumpet player." I'm just saying. On top of muting the criticisms of these once strong musicians, the jazz tours did not only promoted diplomacy, but they helped aid the efforts of the United States security state in other ways, unbeknownst to people like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. For instance, in 1960, when Congo earned its independence from Belgium after one of the most brutal colonial rules, to this day, Congo is suffering. I've done some videos about that. Scott Cannon Radio on YouTube. Check out my stuff about the Congo. To this day, Congo is suffering after brutal colonialism. But in 1960, they earned independence, and they elected Patrice Lumumba, who was elected their first prime minister in an independent Congo. He expressed his desire to use the vast mineral wealth in Congo to develop it economically and help his own people. Just like we spoke about in the first segment about Killmonger being considered the bad guy in the Black Panther because he wanted to use the wealth of Wakanda to actually help Wakandan people and other black people be free from oppression. Patrice Lumumba was considered the bad guy by Washington when he came into power and said, yeah, we want to use our vast mineral wealth in this country to help, the Congolese people. So in August of 1960, the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, who the airport in Washington, D.C. is named after to this day, by the way. If you go to Washington, D.C., you go to Dulles Airport. That's after Allen Dulles. In August 18th, 1960, he met with Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, our president, to plan the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba. Soon the plans would be made, and they involved supporting Joseph Mobutu and his militia to take over the country. When Louis Armstrong began his tour in Congo in October, Lumumba had already been put under house arrest. His tour was promoted in the West as a way of distracting Western audiences from what was actually going on in the Congo, which was a coup led by Western governments like the United States and Belgium. His first stop was in Leopoldville, which is now called Kinshasa, but back then it was Leopoldville, and he played to a sold-out crowd. The more curious aspect of this tour was the second stop, Elizabethville, which was the capital of the mineral-rich province called Katanga. While under the pretense of attending a Louis Armstrong concert, the CIA's attaché, Larry Devlin, who was undercover as an embassy staffer, he was able to actually move freely in Katanga and connect to people who were staging the coup. A few months after this concert, the democratically elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated. And to this day, the mineral wealth of Congo remains in the hands of Western companies like Union Miniere. Now, supposedly jazz diplomacy ended in the 1990s. The State Department continues to sponsor similar programs in the interest of its national security state. Nowadays, much of the function of the CIA has been taken over by the National Endowment of Democracy. Yes, the NED. Now, what has the NED been doing the last 30 years? Well, they helped overthrow Haiti's government in 2004. They helped lead a coup against the democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was just like Lumumba, just like all the other leaders, Mossadegh, just like my guy in Chile, I forget what his name is. I can't believe Salvador Allende, just like Salvador Allende in Chile, and many of the leaders in Latin America that the United States government is up overthrow. He was a leftist, and because of that, the U.S. overthrew him. And this was in 2004. So this is like 21st century stuff. And so Haiti, even to this day, is awash in money from the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, that's not all. The NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has currently tried to foment a coup in Iran. In September of 2022, when protests erupted in Iran over the country's hijab rules, sparking a wave of unrest that drew global attention, at the heart of this controversy was a woman named Masih Alinejad, who is a reporter for The Voice of America. Literally, The Voice of America, that's who she works for. She played a pivotal role in fanning the flames of dissent. And of course, she was backed by the National Endowment for Democracy. According to reports from a Lebanese news channel, Al Mayadeen, she received a staggering $628,000 in funding from the National Endowment for Democracy and other United States-based organizations between 2015 and 2022. The NED also is, you want to know why we're in Ukraine right now? You want to know how this ended up? Well, in 2004, during the Orange Revolution in 2004, the NED was involved. And in the 2013-2014 Euromaidan protest, where there was an actual coup against Ukraine's government, where a more Western skeptic government was replaced by a more American-friendly government. The NED provided substantial funding to the Ukrainian opposition groups. Now, these groups actually were bombing other Ukrainian citizens in the Donbass region, which is Russian-speaking. So when Vladimir Putin invaded in 2022, he invaded, at least in part, to stop that. 15,000 Ukrainian citizens had been bombed by their own government with the help of the National Endowment of Democracy in the United States, thanks to a coup that we helped plan and plot and strategize and carry out in their country. Between 2007 and 2015, NED allocated over $30 million to Ukrainian NGOs to promote civic participation. However, during the Euromaidan protest, NED's funding was seen as exacerbating tensions and stoking unrest. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is a product of what the NED has continued to do. In the Philippines, the NED's influence has been about supporting media outlets like Rappler, which receives significant funding from the NED. During the 2022 general elections, Rappler's activities come under scrutiny for influencing the election in the Philippines, which raised concerns about the role of all foreign-backed media in national elections. So if you listen to the corporate media in this country, they'll tell you that Vladimir Putin is influencing our elections with a few Facebook ads and saying, oh, well, Vladimir Putin had people on Facebook saying nice things about Trump. Meanwhile, the United States government is literally all over the world, funding entities to interfere in other people's elections. And before we go to a break, because we got to get to the happy happies, one last one. India. India is more and more finding itself in the crosshairs of the National Endowment for Democracy, particularly under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Through its funding of the Journal of Democracy, the NED has been instrumental in shaping international narratives about the state of democracy in India. In July 2023, the journal published a series of articles criticizing India's diplomatic trajectory under Modi, suggesting that the country's democracy was in decline. By April of 2024, this rhetoric has escalated, with articles claiming that India's pluralistic secular democracy was at risk if Modi secured a third consecutive term. So this is what the United States government does, folks. This is what they do. This is what they go around the world doing. And this is what they're here doing. They are influencing every single facet of our culture: music, movies, TV, sports. You wonder why the NFL has jets flying over it during the national anthem and why the players are required to stand for the national anthem now? They didn't used to have any of that. The government literally started paying the NFL to do that. All right, folks, let me get to this caller before I get to a break. Hello, caller.
I just want to thank you.
It's all good.
For your reporting. I want to thank you. That's man, oh man. It's so deep. It is just so deep. I mean, toxicity is everywhere. And my God. And oh, yeah, by the way, Israel is a terrorist nation, of course,
Of course.
But anyway, I appreciate it. I mean, inspirational, bro. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you for calling, brother. You feel free to call back anytime.
Yes, sir.
It's all good.
Bye.
All right, folks. Whew, that was a long segment, but I felt like that really needed to be had, especially as we get closer to the election. So we got to go to a break really quick. When we come back, we're going to change the pace with some happies. We'll be right back after these. Straight out of the cannon with me, Scott Cannon, here on WLTH 1370 AM. That's 92.7 and the FM dial if you're nasty. Don't go nowhere.